Victor Caldwell didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door of Blackthorn Ranch's main house like a man who already owned it, dropped a leather folder on Nathan Blackthorn's desk, and said, "Sign it by Friday, or I'll have the sheriff remove you myself." He didn't look at Nathan when he said it. He looked around the room, at the photographs on the wall, at the child's drawing pin near the fireplace, at everything Nathan had left. The way a man looks at furniture he's already decided to rearrange. Then he picked up his hat, smoothed the brim with 2 fingers, and walked out without closing the door behind him. Nathan sat there for a long moment, staring at the folder he hadn't opened yet. He already knew what was inside. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a person who has already lost so much, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really began. The winter of 1895 came to Holt County, Texas. The way bad news always comes, quietly at first, and then all at once. Evelyn Carter had been walking for the better part of 2 hours by the time the main gate of Blackthorn Ranch came into view. Her boots were holding together through nothing but stubbornness and the cold, and the bag over her shoulder wasn't heavy because it contained anything valuable. It was heavy because every mile of the road from Calverton had settled into it somehow, the way long walks do when you don't know for certain what's waiting at the other end. She stopped at the gate. There was no one there to meet her. The letter she'd received 2 weeks ago passed through the hands of Mrs. Aldridge at the dry goods store, who'd heard from the feed man, who'd heard from someone at the county seat that Blackthorn Ranch was looking for household help, had not specified much beyond a wage and a start date. It had not been signed by Nathan Blackthorn himself. It had been signed by someone named Greer, who Evelyn would later learn was the ranch foreman, a man of approximately 60 words per day on a generous afternoon. She pushed open the gate herself. The ranch was not what she'd expected, and she'd expected something. Everyone in Holt County had heard of Blackthorn Ranch. You couldn't grow up in that part of Texas without hearing the name the way you heard weather, as a fact of the landscape, something that was simply there and had always been there. Nathan Blackthorn's grandfather had broken the first ground. His father Edmund had built the house, expanded the herds, fought off 3 separate attempts by competing landowners to absorb the property into larger operations. Nathan had inherited it all at 31, along with a reputation for being capable, hard, and not particularly interested in being liked. What Evelyn hadn't expected was the silence. A ranch that size should have had noise, hands moving between buildings, the constant low presence of cattle, the clatter of the working day. There was some of that, but underneath it, or maybe behind it, there was a quiet that didn't belong to a busy place. It was the quiet of a house where people had stopped talking to each other. She recognized it. She'd grown up in one. A man appeared from the direction of the stables, medium height, weathered in the specific way that outdoor labor weathers people, not aged so much as compressed, like the years had pressed down on him and he'd held his shape. He looked at her bag first, then at her face. "You the Carter woman?" he said. "Evelyn Carter, yes." "Greer." He didn't offer his hand. "Come on then." He walked. She followed. That was the entire welcome. The kitchen was large and cold when he showed her in. The stove existed and appeared functional. There were pots. There were dry goods in varying states of organization, some careful, most not. Someone had been cooking here, but without much attention or interest. The bread from what appeared to be yesterday sat on the counter with one end hacked off at an angle. "Previous girl left in October," Greer said. "Before that, there was a woman from Marlin, but she didn't last the month." He paused. "Mr. Blackthorn isn't—" He stopped there and seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "Breakfast is at 5:30, dinner at noon if the hands are in, supper at 7. The girl, Rose, Mr. Blackthorn's daughter, she eats supper with the household." "How old is Rose?" 7, maybe 8 now. He said it in a way that suggested the specific number was not information he'd been asked to track. "She's quiet." Evelyn looked around the kitchen. There was a window that faced east. She noticed the latch was broken, the kind of broken that happens slowly and gets ignored because fixing it requires thinking about it. and thinking about it requires noticing it. And noticing small things requires a kind of attention that grief tends to eat first. "I'll need a few things from town," she said. "Not immediately, but within the week." Greer looked at her the way people look at someone who has said something mildly unexpected. "Make a list. The supply runs on Thursday." "All right. Your room's through here." The room was small and cold and had a window that looked out onto the side yard. There was a bed with a reasonable mattress and a washstand and a hook on the wall for clothing. Greer set her bag inside the door without being asked and stood in the doorway with the particular posture of a man who has one more thing to say and is deciding whether to say it. "Mr. Blackthorn will want to meet you," he said. "Tonight, most likely before supper." He doesn't... Again, that pause, that reconsideration. Just answer what he asks and don't push past it. He's got enough on his mind. "I'm not here to add to it," Evelyn said. Greer looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and left. She sat on the edge of the bed for approximately 3 minutes, which was as long as she allowed herself to sit still in new places before the discomfort of stillness became worse than the discomfort of moving. Then she stood up, unpacked her bag. It took very little time, and went back to the kitchen to start assessing what she actually had to work with. She met Nathan Blackthorn at 6:30 when he came in from whatever had occupied the afternoon. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the back steps, the door, then silence while he registered that something was different about the kitchen. The smell, probably. She had a proper pot of stew going and had found, in the back of a cabinet that had apparently been ignored for some time, a jar of dried herbs that were still usable. He was taller than she'd pictured from the stories. That was the first thing. The second thing was the look on his face. Not hostile exactly, but constructed. The way someone looks when they've decided not to let the outside of them show what's on the inside, and they've been making that decision so consistently it's become the default expression. He looked at the stove, then at her. "You're the new hire," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Evelyn Carter, yes." "Greer explained the schedule?" He did. Nathan pulled out the chair at the head of the kitchen table and sat down, though she hadn't offered him a seat in his own house and would not have presumed to. He put his hat on the table, which she'd later learn he always did. Not from carelessness, but from habit. From a time when he'd eaten at this table with his wife, and she'd teased him every single time about it until it became a ritual, and now the hat went on the table partly because his hands remembered the motion, and partly, she suspected, because some part of him was still having that conversation. She didn't know any of that yet. "The previous woman," he said, "she left in October." Mr. Greer mentioned. Before that there was a woman from Marlin. He mentioned that too. Nathan looked at her. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmth, not welcome, but a form of attention. The quality of being actually looked at rather than passed. "You have references," he said, "from the Aldridge household in Calverton. 3 years, and before that 2 seasons at the Marsh Farm outside of Denton." "I'll write to Aldridge." "That's reasonable," she said. He seemed to have expected her to say something else, to reassure him the references would be good, or to thank him for the opportunity, or to fill the silence with something softer. She didn't. She went back to the stew and gave it a stir. "Rose eats at 7, she said. "I'll have supper ready. Is there anything she won't eat that I should know about?" Another pause, shorter this time. "She doesn't like turnip," Nathan said. "She'll eat around it and not say anything, but she doesn't like it." Noted. He left. She finished the stew. Rose Blackthorn appeared at the kitchen door at 7:05, as though she'd been standing nearby for some time working up to it. She was small for 7 or 8. Greer's uncertainty apparently was contagious. With dark hair that had been braided by someone who knew how to braid hair, but had done it some time ago, and the braid had been sleeping on since. She had her father's eyes, or at least the same quality in them. Watchful, not unfriendly, but careful about where trust went. She looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back. "You're the new cook," Rose said. "Housekeeper and cook, yes." "Evelyn." Rose considered this. "The last one cried a lot." "That sounds tiring." It was. Rose looked at the pot on the stove. What is that? Beef stew, with carrots and onion and potato. No turnip? No turnip. Something in Rose's face settled, very slightly, like a small creature that has decided the environment is not immediately threatening. She sat down at the table without being invited, put her elbows on it, and rested her chin in both hands in the way that children do when they're deciding whether a new person is worth the effort of being curious about. My grandfather Edmund is inside, she said. He doesn't come to the kitchen anymore. His legs are bad. I'll take a plate into him. He won't thank you. He doesn't have to. Rose watched her for another moment. Do you know how to fix hair? I do. Mine's a mess. I noticed. Bring me a brush after supper and we'll sort it out. For the first time, something in Rose's expression broke slightly. Not quite a smile, more the preparation for one. She put her chin back in her hands and watched Evelyn move around the kitchen with the particular focused attention that lonely children bring to new things, cataloging everything, storing it against future need. Edmund Blackthorn was 63 and had the look of a man who had been larger. Not fat, but substantial. The kind of man whose physical presence had been one of his primary tools for a long time, and who was now renegotiating with a body that was refusing several of the terms. His legs had been giving out on him for 2 years. Some days were better than others. Today appeared to be neither. He was in the room off the main hall that had become his by necessity. A chair, a side table with a lamp and a glass of water, a window that looked out onto land his father had acquired and that his grandson would one day inherit, assuming there was still something to inherit. He didn't turn when Evelyn knocked and came in. He watched the window. Mr. Blackthorn, she said, I'm Evelyn Carter. I've taken over the household. How long will you last? He said. Not a question, an expectation with a question's clothes on. I don't know, she said honestly. But I'm not planning on leaving, so we'll have to see. That made him turn. He looked at her the way old men look at people who say unexpected things, with an interest they're not ready to show too much of. Sit down, he said. She sat. She'd brought the stew and some bread on a tray, which she set on the side table within his reach. Nathan's going to be difficult, Edmund said. It was not a warning exactly, more like a weather report. Most people are in their way. His wife died 18 months ago, his brother the year before that. Edmund said it flatly, the way people say things they've had to say enough times that the words have worn smooth. He's been running this ranch on spite and stubbornness since then and calling it fine. It doesn't look fine, Evelyn said. Edmund looked at her again. This time the interest was less hidden. No, he said. It doesn't. She stood. The bread is fresh. Eat while it's warm. She left him to it. Behind her, she heard the sound of the tray being pulled closer, which was enough. She had been at Blackthorn Ranch 11 days when she found the discrepancy. It was not something she'd been looking for. She'd been going through the household accounts. Part of her job, as she'd understood it, was to manage the domestic expenditures. And she had a habit, carried over from the Aldridge household where the books had been frequently wrong in small ways that added up to significant ones, of checking column totals by hand even when the ledger presented them as settled. The household accounts were fine. A little wasteful in some areas, underspent in others, but nothing that couldn't be straightened out with attention. It was when she'd gone to find a purchase receipt for the last delivery of lamp oil, which had been marked as 11 gallons, but which she was fairly certain had been 9, based on what she'd actually counted in the storage room, that she opened the wrong drawer in the study desk and found a second ledger. This was not unusual in itself. Ranch operations this size ran multiple books, one for livestock, one for land transactions, one for equipment and maintenance. She wouldn't have thought anything of it except that the entries in this ledger were in a different hand from the others. And some of the dates were wrong. Not obviously wrong, not the kind of wrong that announces itself. The kind of wrong that requires you to cross-reference against something else. To notice that the payment recorded on the 14th couldn't have been received by the party listed because that party, according to the county records Evelyn had seen when she'd registered her own arrival at the county seat, had filed for dissolution of business 6 weeks prior to the date in the ledger. She closed the ledger, put it back exactly where she'd found it. She stood in the study for a moment, looking at the desk, at the wall of windows behind it that looked out onto Nathan Blackthorn's empire of grass and fence and cattle, and she thought about the man who'd come to this house 11 days ago and put a folder on a desk and told its owner to sign by Friday. She'd heard about that. Greer had mentioned it in the terse, compressed way Greer mentioned things, and Rose had mentioned it in the way children mention things that frighten them without knowing quite what they mean. Victor Caldwell. The name had a weight in Holt County the way certain names do, not because the person behind it was universally respected, but because they were universally understood to have power, and power and respect are not the same thing, though they're often in the same room. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and finished the supper preparations and did not mention what she'd found to anyone. Not yet. Tick. The trouble with living in a house where people have stopped talking to each other is that you start to see the shape of all the things not being said. Nathan Blackthorn managed his ranch. He was in the barn before dawn, in the saddle for most of the day, in his study in the evenings with the door closed. He ate at the kitchen table without much ceremony and answered questions directly when asked and did not ask many in return. He was not unkind. He was careful in the way that people are careful when they've learned that being less careful costs them things they can't afford to lose again. He noticed Evelyn. She was aware of this without it being awkward, the way you're aware of weather, as a condition, not an imposition. He watched her fix the broken window latch on her third day without asking anyone for help or permission, using a screwdriver from the tool shed that she'd located by asking Greer where it was. He watched her sit with Edmund in the evenings for a half hour after supper, not talking much, just present. He watched her with Rose. Mostly he watched her with Rose. Rose had started coming to the kitchen in the mornings before breakfast, just to be there. She'd sit at the table and watch Evelyn work and occasionally say something. About school, about a horse she particularly liked, about a dream she'd had that made no particular narrative sense, but that she felt the need to report. And Evelyn would respond with the particular skill of someone who knows that what's being offered isn't really the surface content of the words, but the fact of their being said at all. The willingness to speak to someone. The practice of trust. Nathan saw this and said nothing about it. On the 14th day, he came into the kitchen after supper when Rose had gone to bed and Evelyn was cleaning up. He sat at the table. She didn't stop what she was doing. Greer says you fixed the east pasture fence post, Nathan said. One of the hands was going to get to it eventually. I had wire and I was out there already. You know fence repair. I know a lot of things. She said it without pride, as a plain statement. I grew up on a working farm, small one, the kind where everyone does everything. Nathan was quiet for a moment. The Aldridge household, that's domestic work. Yes, after the farm. My father died and the farm went to debt. I'm sorry. It was 7 years ago. She said this not to dismiss the condolence, but to be accurate about where it fell in the timeline. Nathan turned his hat in his hands. He'd brought it in. It had gone to the table. There was that unconscious ritual again. Caldwell, he said, you've heard the name. Hard not to. He's claiming a debt against the ranch. Says my father borrowed against the north portion in 1887 and the payments lapsed. His voice was even. The evenness cost something. Says he has documentation. Do you have your copies of the 1887 accounts? He looked at her. Most of them. Most. There was a fire in the South outbuilding in '89. Some records were lost. Evelyn folded the dishcloth and set it on the counter. Mr. Blackthorn, she said, I think you should know, and I found something in the study. A ledger in the desk. I wasn't looking through your papers deliberately. I was trying to locate a receipt, but there are some entries in it that concern me. Nathan went very still. What kind of entries? Payment records. In a different hand from your primary accounts. Some of the dates don't hold up against external records I happened to see when I registered at the county seat. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was doing what the wind does in Texas in winter, which is to say, it was taking the whole landscape and shaking it slightly. Show me, Nathan said. She did. He sat at the study desk with the ledger open, and she stood nearby while he went through it. She watched his face, not intrusively, but with the same calibrated attention she'd been applying to everything since she arrived. She watched him see what she'd seen, and then see more, because it was his ranch and he knew things she didn't about what the numbers should have looked like and what they were showing instead. When he looked up, there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not yet anger. That would come. This was the particular look of someone who has suspected something and hoped they were wrong and just found out they weren't. "This isn't the only one," he said. "I thought it might not be. There are two more. Greer's been telling me for months something wasn't adding up in the supply accounts, but I told him to—" He stopped, pressed his mouth flat. "I told him I'd look at it when I had time." "You've had a great deal on your mind." "That's not an excuse." "No," she said. "It isn't. But it's a reason, and reasons matter when you're trying to understand how something happened so you can figure out how to fix it." Nathan looked at her. She was not sure what she expected him to say. She was aware that she had been, in the last half hour, considerably more direct with this man than a housekeeper of 2 weeks had any standing to be, and that he was a man who was accustomed to managing his own affairs and his own house and his own crisis without input from people he'd known for 14 days. What he said was, "Can you read account ledgers?" "I can. Not just the domestic ones. I worked 2 years for a man in Denton who had 7 separate operations and kept the books for all of them in a system so complicated he was the only one who understood it. When he died, the family asked me to reconstruct the accounts from what was left, so the estate could be settled. I spent 4 months with those books. I understand how this kind of thing works." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, went to the cabinet behind the desk, opened it. Inside were 3 more ledgers, 2 document envelopes, and a box that appeared to contain correspondence. "Tell me what you see," he said. It was not a request exactly. It was something more like a door opening that had been closed for a long time, and the person behind it finally stepping back to let the air in. Evelyn pulled her chair closer to the desk and opened the first ledger. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the cattle shifted somewhere in the dark, and the winter held Blackthorn Ranch in its cold and ordinary grip, the same as it held everything else. None of it knew yet what was sitting in that study, 2 people and a pool of lamplight and a set of numbers that would eventually blow the whole rotten structure of Victor Caldwell's empire apart at the seams. But the night Evelyn Carter sat down with those ledgers was the night it began. They worked until close to midnight. That was the first thing Nathan Blackthorn would remember about that night. Later, when he tried to reconstruct how it had all started, not the ledgers themselves, not the numbers, but the fact that a woman he'd known for 2 weeks sat across from him at his father's desk and worked until nearly midnight without being asked to, without complaining about it, without performing the effort the way some people perform effort when they want you to notice. She just worked. Cross-referencing. Making small notes in the margin of a piece of blank paper she'd found in the top drawer. Asking questions when she needed clarification and not asking them when she didn't. Around 11 o'clock, she got up and came back with 2 cups of coffee and set one near his elbow without comment. He hadn't even heard her go to the kitchen. By the time they stopped, not because they'd finished, but because the pattern had become clear enough that continuing further that night would only compound the tiredness without adding much to the understanding. They had identified at least 4 separate instances where payments recorded in the secondary ledger did not correspond to any actual transaction Nathan could verify. The amounts were not enormous individually. That was the design of it. Small enough to miss if you weren't looking, large enough, accumulated, to build a case. "Caldwell's been preparing this for a while," Nathan said. He was not asking. "At least 2 years based on what's here. Maybe longer." Evelyn set down her pencil. "The earliest entry I can't verify is from January of 1893. Nathan sat back. His jaw worked for a moment. "My wife was ill by then. I wasn't paying attention to everything I should have been." Evelyn did not offer a consolation. She'd found that consolations, offered too quickly, were a way of changing the subject. And this was not a subject that should be changed. She let it sit. "He knew that," Nathan said, then quieter. "He knew exactly when to start." "That's how this kind of scheme works," she said. "It doesn't begin when you're strong. It begins when something has already taken your attention somewhere else." Nathan looked at the stack of papers between them. "I need a lawyer." You need a lawyer, and you need your original land documentation, and you need whatever records survived the 1889 fire, and you need to know which of your current accounts Caldwell has any visibility into. She paused. Does he have connections to the bank in Calverton? Something crossed Nathan's face. He owns 40% of it. Evelyn absorbed this. Then don't move any funds through Calverton until this is settled. Nathan looked at her. I realize that's not my place to say, she said. No, he said. Say it. Say what you see. She didn't sleep much. That was not unusual for her in new places. Her mind had a habit of continuing to work after the rest of her had nominally agreed to rest. She lay in the small room off the kitchen and turned things over. The ledger entries. The dates. The deliberate modesty of the fraud. The way it had been built to look like accounting error rather than theft. Someone had designed this carefully. Someone who understood ranch accounting well enough to know what an oversight looked like. That bothered her more than the numbers themselves, because it meant someone close. In the morning, she made breakfast at 5:15, 15 minutes ahead of the usual time, because she'd been awake since 4 anyway, and because she wanted to think through the supply accounts before the day's noise started. Greer came in at 5:20 and stopped when he saw her already at the stove. Couldn't sleep, she said, before he could ask. Greer poured himself coffee and sat down. He was quiet in the particular way of men who spend most of their time outdoors, comfortable with silence the way you're comfortable with weather, not because you love it, but because it's simply the condition, and fighting it is a waste. Greer, she said, the supply accounts. You told Mr. Blackthorn something wasn't adding up. Greer looked at her over the rim of his cup. He mentioned that to you. He did. I'm not asking you to go behind his back. He's aware I'm asking. A pause. When did he tell you that? Last night. Greer set his cup down. He looked at the table for a moment, then at the window, then back at her. 3 months ago, I noticed we were being billed for feed deliveries that didn't match what was coming in. Not a lot, but consistent. He said it like a man reading from a list he'd memorized because no one had asked him to write it down. The delivery records from Holt Feed and Supply show full amounts. Our inventory doesn't. Did you talk to the delivery man? Pete Aldis. He's worked that route for 9 years. He says he delivers what the receipt says. Greer's mouth pressed flat. Either Pete's lying or somebody between the delivery and the ledger is adjusting the numbers. And Pete's been doing that route since before Nathan's father took ill. I don't think Pete's lying. Who updates the supply ledger after a delivery? Greer was quiet for a moment. Not a comfortable quiet. Crane, he said. Dan Crane. He's been the ranch accountant for 3 years. Where did Nathan hire him from? He came recommended. Through the Calverton Bank. Greer said it and then stopped, as if he'd only just heard himself say it. All right, Evelyn said. She turned back to the stove. Eat your breakfast. She said nothing else about it, but she filed Dan Crane's name away in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed returning to, and she thought about who in Holt County would know enough about the Calverton Bank's personnel to tell her what she needed to know, without it getting back to the wrong people. Nathan left early that morning for the north portion, where 2 of the hands had reported a section of broken fence line that needed assessing before more cattle drifted. He'd told Evelyn before he left, which was a change from the first 2 weeks when he'd simply gone and the household had been informed by his absence. It was a small thing. She noticed it. Edmund Blackthorn was in better spirits by mid-morning, which was how it often went with him. Bad nights, better days, then a slow accumulation of bad days that made the better ones harder to find. He called for her from the hall, and she went in and found him sitting up with more alertness than usual, watching the window. Sit down, he said. Nathan told me what you found last night. He told you this morning? He came in before he left. He doesn't usually do that. Edmund looked at his hands, which had been strong hands for 60 years, and were now somewhat reduced from that, but still had the shape of what they'd been. He's been carrying this alone since the letter came from Caldwell. Won't let me worry about it. He's protecting you. He's making the same mistake his mother made with me when she was ill. Thought protecting the people you love meant keeping the weight off them. Edmund's voice had an edge to it. Not anger at Nathan, but at the idea itself, the well-meaning blindness of it. You can't protect people from the truth of what's happening. All you do is make sure they find out later, when there's less time. Evelyn considered this. He knows that now, I think, or he's starting to. Because of you. Because he was ready to. She said it honestly, not modestly. Someone can't make a person ready to change how they see things. They have to get there on their own. I just happened to arrive when he was nearly there. Edmund looked at her with that direct, assessing look she'd noticed from the first evening. He had the same eyes as Nathan, or Nathan had his, that quality of looking at you and actually seeing something rather than just the surface of you. "What's your read on Caldwell?" Edmund said. "I don't know him." "You've read his scheme. What kind of man designed something like that?" Evelyn thought about it. Patient. He waited for the right moment. Smart. The amounts are small enough to look like slippage, and connected enough to have someone inside this ranch feeding him information. She paused. He's not someone who acts out of simple greed. He wants the land specifically. "He's always wanted this land specifically," Edmund said. "Going back 20 years. He and my father had dealings once, and they went wrong, and Caldwell never forgot it." He shifted in his chair, a careful movement that spoke to what his legs were doing to him that morning. "This isn't only about money, Miss Carter. It's personal. Men like Caldwell, when it's personal, they don't stop at one approach. You think there's more than the financial claim? I think a man who's been planning this for 2 years didn't stake everything on one approach." She was in the yard shortly before noon, returning from the root cellar with potatoes for dinner, when a buggy she didn't recognize came up the main drive. Well-maintained buggy, better than most you'd see in Holt County on an ordinary Tuesday. The man who stepped out of it was somewhere in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the deliberate way of men who want their clothing to make an argument before they open their mouths. He looked at the house. Then he looked at Evelyn, standing there with a sack of potatoes and her hair coming out of its pins from the wind. The way he looked at her was the thing. It wasn't rude, exactly. It was the look of someone who has cataloged you in under 3 seconds and assigned you a category so far below their attention that looking directly at you is already a form of generosity. "I'm here to see Nathan Blackthorn," he said. "Tell him Victor Caldwell is here." She met his eyes. "Mr. Blackthorn is on the north pasture. He's not expected back until early afternoon." "Then I'll wait. I'll let him know you called." Something in Caldwell's expression adjusted slightly. A recalibration. He'd expected her to step aside, to offer to show him in, to bring him coffee, to arrange herself around his convenience. "I said I'll wait," he said, more precisely this time. "And I said I'll let him know you called." She kept her voice even, conversational, even. "This is a working ranch, Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Blackthorn is working. When he returns, he'll know you were here." The silence between them was approximately 4 seconds long. Caldwell smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that sits just at the edge of warmth without committing to it. "And you are?" "The housekeeper." "Right." He looked at her for one more moment, that same assessing look, but slower this time and less dismissive, more like a man revising a first impression, though not far enough to change the fundamental conclusion. "Tell him it's time-sensitive." "I'll tell him you said so." He got back into the buggy. As it turned back down the drive, she watched it go, and she was aware of something she couldn't quite name. Not fear, because it wasn't fear, but a version of recognition. The specific feeling of being seen by someone who does not wish you well and now knows your face. She went inside and put the potatoes on. "What?" Nathan came back at 1:30, wind-burned and in a poor temper about the fence situation, which had been worse than reported. She told him about Caldwell as he washed his hands at the kitchen pump. His back stiffened. "He came here himself." "He did." "He usually sends Pryor." Pryor was Caldwell's man. She'd heard the name but not met him. "If he came himself, it means he's impatient." "Or he's sending a message," Evelyn said, "that he can come here whenever he likes, and you can't stop him." Nathan dried his hands. His jaw was working again. That same tell, the thing his face did when he was suppressing something. What did he say to you? He told me to tell you it was time sensitive. And you told him that you were working and you'd know he called. Nathan looked at her. He didn't like that. He was polite about not liking it. Caldwell's always polite. He said it the way you'd say a word in a foreign language you don't like the sound of. That's what makes him... He didn't finish the sentence. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on it, looking at them. I need to get someone out to look at those ledgers. Someone I trust. The lawyer in Beaumont, Hargrove. He's good, and he's not connected to anyone in Calverton. That's the right instinct. Can you write a summary of what we found last night? The specific entries, the dates, what they don't match against. Something I can send him before I ride out there. I can have it done by this evening. He nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment. He said something to you, Nathan said, besides the time-sensitive business. He wanted to know who I was. What did you tell him? The housekeeper. Nathan was quiet for another moment. Something moved through his expression, complex and not quite nameable. He'll find out more than that, he said. Caldwell finds out everything about everyone in his way. It's one of the things he does. Then he'll find out I'm a housekeeper from Calverton with no money and no land and no family connections, Evelyn said. I imagine that's not very worrying to him. You'd think, Nathan said. He didn't say what he meant by that. He got up and went to wash his face, and she started the noon meal, and neither of them mentioned it again. But the words sat in the kitchen after he'd left the room, taking up a certain amount of space. She wrote the summary that afternoon in the study, using the desk while Nathan was in the barn for the afternoon work. It took her 2 hours to do it properly. She wanted it organized well enough that a lawyer, seeing it for the first time, could follow the logic without her there to explain the sequence. She cross-referenced each anomalous entry against what she could document from external sources, noted clearly what she could prove versus what she suspected but couldn't yet verify, and flagged the question of Dan Crane's hiring and its connection to the Calverton Bank in a separate section at the bottom. Rose came in midway through and sat in the corner chair with a book that she may or may not have been reading, because when Evelyn looked up every few minutes, the pages hadn't turned. Is it about Mr. Caldwell? Rose said eventually. What makes you ask? Because that's the only thing Papa's been worried about that he pretends he isn't. She said it with the blunt precision of children, who sometimes understand the shape of things more clearly than adults because they haven't yet learned to talk around them. He came here before, in the fall. He and Papa talked in the study, and when Papa came out, he had that face. What face? The one where he's deciding not to tell me something. Evelyn set her pen down for a moment. Rose, your father's working very hard to make sure everything's all right. I know that. Rose's tone said, I'm 7, not stupid. I just want to know if it's going to be. Evelyn thought about lying and decided against it. I don't know yet, she said, but there are more people working on it than just your father. That much I can tell you. Rose considered this. She appeared to find it satisfactory, or at least more satisfactory than a false reassurance would have been. She went back to her book, and this time the pages turned. Greer found Dan Crane that evening going through the secondary supply ledger in the small office behind the equipment barn. This was not unusual. Crane worked late often, which everyone had taken as a sign of diligence. Greer had taken it as a sign of diligence too, until 20 minutes ago when he'd had a conversation with Nathan that reframed everything. He stood in the doorway of the office and watched Crane for a moment before Crane heard him. Crane was 34, narrow-faced, careful in his movements. He'd been a pleasant enough presence on the ranch, not warm, but competent seeming, and ranch accountants weren't hired for warmth. He looked up when he noticed Greer. Evening, he said. Working late, Greer said, trying to get the quarterly supply figures reconciled before the end of the month. Greer nodded slowly. He leaned against the doorframe. Dan, he said, when you came on here 3 years ago, came through the Calverton Bank, is that right? Something happened in Crane's expression. Very small. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, and Greer had spent 40 years reading horses and men in conditions that required precision. Word got around I was available, Crane said. Someone there mentioned it to Mr. Blackthorn. Right. Greer let the silence stretch. Just wondered. He left without saying anything else. He went straight to the house and knocked on the study door. Nathan opened it. Evelyn was at the desk with a stack of papers. She looked up. "He knows something's changed," Greer said without preamble. "I didn't say anything direct, but he knows." Nathan's expression tightened. "If he contacts Caldwell, he might already have. I don't know." Greer looked at the papers on the desk. "What do you want to do?" Nathan looked at Evelyn. She set down her pen. "If you confront Crane directly, he'll deny it and likely destroy whatever he has here before you can look at it," she said. "And it might tip Caldwell that you're building a case. If we wait, we control the information. Crane doesn't know what we have. He doesn't know what I found or what I've documented." She looked at Nathan directly. "Let him think the ledger was never found. Let him keep coming in and doing what he's doing. Every entry he makes from here forward either proves the scheme or gives us a date to work backward from." Greer looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the window. "That means letting a thief keep working in my house," Nathan said, "for a short time, until the lawyer gets here." Another silence. Nathan's hands were on his desk, flat, the same posture as at the kitchen table. "All right," he said. Then to Greer, "Don't let on, and don't leave him alone with any of the primary accounts." Greer nodded and left. The door closed. Evelyn went back to the summary she was writing. "You've done this before," Nathan said. Not an accusation. A statement with a question folded inside it. "Done what?" "Thought through a situation like a..." He looked for the word. "Like someone managing a problem from the outside while being on the inside of it." "My father had a man steal from him for 4 years before it came out," Evelyn said. "By then there wasn't much left to salvage." She picked up her pen. "I was 15. I watched the whole thing. I watched how it happened, and I watched what went wrong when he tried to stop it too fast without the right preparation." She wrote a line, considered it, kept going. "You learn what you learn." Nathan said nothing for a long time. The lamp between them put shadows at the edges of the room. Outside, the evening had gone full dark and cold, the kind of cold that makes the ranch sounds different, cleaner, more separate, each one distinct in the stillness. "The lawyer," he said. "I'll ride for Beaumont on Thursday. Take copies of what I've written, not the originals. Keep those here in a different location from where Crane can access them." "Where would you suggest?" She thought about it. "Edmund's room." Nathan almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the first near approximation of one she'd seen on him. He'd enjoy that. "I thought he might." Nathan picked up the summary she'd been working on and read the first page, then the second. He read carefully, the way people read things they're actually trying to understand rather than skim. She kept writing. When he finished, he set it down. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed it without remarking on it. "If this goes the way it might, if it gets harder before it gets better, I want you to know that whatever happens with this ranch is not your problem to carry. You work here. You've already done more than anyone could have expected. But what comes next could get..." "Mr. Blackthorn," she said. He stopped. "I'll tell you if I want to leave," she said. "I haven't wanted to yet." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from the desk, the automatic motion, the unconscious ritual, and stood up. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. "Good night." He left. She kept writing. The lamp held its small circle against the dark, and she worked through it, putting the truth of what she'd found into an order that a court could follow, building the first wall of the thing that would eventually, not without cost and not without difficulty, bring Victor Caldwell's carefully constructed world down around him. She didn't know that yet. She only knew the work in front of her. That was enough for one night. Nathan rode out for Beaumont on Thursday as he'd said he would, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, with copies of Evelyn's summary folded inside his coat and the originals locked in the cedar box Edmund kept under his bed. He left without ceremony, the way he did everything. A word to Greer about the day's work, a brief stop at the kitchen door where Rose was eating breakfast, a look at Evelyn that carried more in it than either of them had vocabulary for yet, and then the sound of hooves going down the drive and diminishing into the cold morning air. Evelyn watched him go from the kitchen window. Then she turned back to the stove. The days he was gone were not quiet days. She had not expected them to be. Greer kept the ranch running with the competence of a man who had been doing it for decades, and required very little from the house except that meals appear at the right times, and the equipment shed stay organized. Evelyn managed both, along with the laundry and the floors, and the particular ongoing project of making Edmund's room less depressing, which she undertook gradually so he wouldn't notice and object. He noticed on the second day. "You moved the chair," he said when she came in with his lunch. "It was facing away from the window." "I put it that way." "Why would you want to face away from the window?" Edmund looked at her. "I'm not sure anymore," he said after a moment. "It seemed like a good idea at the time." She left the chair where she'd put it. He didn't move it back. What she was actually doing, in the margins of everything else, was continuing to read. She'd gotten Nathan's permission before he left to go through the rest of the study's documents. Not just the ledgers, but the correspondence files, the land transaction records going back to Edmund's time, the notes and receipts, and the accumulated paper trail of a family operating a significant piece of land across multiple decades. It was slow work and not comfortable work, sitting on the floor of the study in the afternoons when Rose was at school and Greer and the hands were out, going through papers with the particular feeling of someone reconstructing a crime scene they arrived at after the fact. What she was looking for specifically was the 1887 land record. The one Caldwell claimed documented a debt. She didn't find it in the study. She found references to it. Nathan's father had written a letter in August of 1887 mentioning a meeting with a banker regarding the north portion, and a follow-up note in October of that year indicating the matter was satisfactorily resolved. But the actual documentation of what that resolution had been was not in the files she had access to, which meant it was either lost in the 1889 fire, or it was somewhere else, or it had been removed. She was thinking about this on the afternoon of the third day, when she heard a horse in the yard and looked out to see someone she didn't recognize tying up at the post. Not a ranch hand. Dressed for town, not for work. She watched from the window as he looked around the yard with the methodical attention of someone building an inventory. She went to the kitchen door. "Can I help you?" she said. He turned. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had seen a lot of weather and not been improved by it. He had the specific quality of stillness that she'd come to associate, from her years of watching people, with men who had learned to be very patient about things they wanted. "Looking for Nathan Blackthorn," he said. "He's not here." "When's he back?" "I couldn't say exactly." The man looked at her with a directness that was just short of rude. "You're the housekeeper." "I am." "Caldwell's heard about you." He said it conversationally, the way you'd mentioned the weather, which was exactly why it was not conversational at all. "Says you turned him away from the door last week." "I told him Mr. Blackthorn was working and I'd pass on the message, which I did." "That's one way to put it." The man looked around the yard again, that same methodical scan. "My name's Pryor. I handle things for Mr. Caldwell." She'd heard the name. This was the man Nathan had mentioned, the one Caldwell usually sent instead of coming himself. The fact that Caldwell had come in person and now sent Pryor back suggested a rotation, a pressure applied from multiple angles, the technique of a man who understood that sustained inconvenience often accomplished more than direct confrontation. "Mr. Pryor," she said, "when Mr. Blackthorn returns, I'll let him know you called." "I'd like to leave something for him." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "Document from Mr. Caldwell's attorney. Time sensitive, as I'm sure you've been told." She came down the steps and took the envelope. She did not open it, and she did not look at it. She looked at Pryor. "It'll be here when he gets back," she said. Pryor nodded once. He looked at her for another moment, and this time the look was different from Caldwell's. Caldwell had dismissed her. Pryor was doing the opposite. He was paying attention to her the way you pay attention to something you've been told to assess. "Long way from Calverton," he said, "for a housekeeper position." "Not so far." "You have people here? In Holt County?" I have a job here, she said. That's enough. He untied his horse. As he mounted, he looked down at her from the height of the saddle. Calverton's a small town, he said. People there know you fairly well, I'd imagine. She met his eyes. I imagine they do. He rode out. She stood in the yard until he was through the gate. Then she went inside and set the envelope on Nathan's desk and stood looking at it without touching it for about 30 seconds before she went back to the kitchen to start supper. That evening, she told Greer about the visit. He listened without expression. Pryor's been in the county before, he said. He came through about a year ago asking around about the Harmon family's water rights. The Harmons lost their place in the spring. Lost it how? Debt claim. Same as what Caldwell's pushing on Nathan. Greer turned his cup in his hands. Before that, it was the McCready farm. And before that, the Bauer operation, north of here. Evelyn looked at him. How many? Greer thought about it. 3 that I know of for certain. Maybe more that didn't make talk. She thought about what Edmund had said. The pattern. The same scheme applied to multiple families. Greer, she said, do you know anyone who's still in contact with the Harmons or the McCreadys? Tom Harmon's working over at the Prescott place now. His wife's sister lives in Calverton. He looked at her steadily. Why? Because if Caldwell used the same method on all of them, they might have documents, things they held on to without knowing they were useful. She looked at her hands on the table. The 1887 record that Caldwell claims proves the Blackthorn debt. I can't find Nathan's copy here, but if Caldwell built the same kind of false documentation for the Harmon claim and someone held on to it, I can show the pattern. Greer was quiet for a long moment. You're not just a housekeeper, he said. I'm exactly a housekeeper, she said. That's the only thing I know how to be. I'm just one who pays attention. He looked at her in the way that Edmund looked at her sometimes. That taking stock, that recalibration. Then he nodded once and got up and rinsed his cup at the pump. I'll talk to Tom Harmon, he said. Nathan came back on Saturday with Hargrove the lawyer, whom he'd convinced to make the ride from Beaumont on the strength of what was in Evelyn's summary. Hargrove was a small, precise man in his 60s who wore spectacles and asked questions in the rapid, overlapping way of someone whose mind moved faster than most conversations could keep up with. He sat in the study with Nathan and Evelyn for 3 hours on Saturday afternoon, going through everything she'd documented, and by the time they finished, he'd covered 2 pages of his own notepad in handwriting so compressed it was nearly illegible to anyone but himself. The pattern is clear enough, he said. What I need is the original land documentation, the 1887 transaction. I haven't been able to find Nathan's copy, Evelyn said. The records from that year are incomplete because of the fire. Caldwell will have his version. The question is whether it's authentic or constructed. Hargrove looked at her over his spectacles. You mentioned other families, similar claims. Greer's looking into it. If you can get me any documentation from those cases, anything that shows the method, that becomes a pattern of fraud, not an isolated dispute. That's considerably stronger. He turned to Nathan. Don't sign anything. Don't respond to anything from Caldwell's attorney without running it through me first. And don't move any money through the Calverton Bank. Already stopped that, Nathan said. Hargrove nodded. He looked at Evelyn again, briefly, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he looked back at his notepad. Who compiled this summary? I did, Evelyn said. It's thorough work. He said it without emphasis, as a plain fact. Where did you train? I didn't. I worked. He nodded as if this explained something. There are lawyers in this state who couldn't have organized this material as clearly as you have. He said this to Nathan, not to her, which was a thing men of his generation did. Credited the work to a woman while addressing the observation to the man in the room. She didn't bristle at it. She was accustomed to it, and it cost her nothing to be accustomed to it, because what mattered was not who got the credit, but whether the work was used. What's the timeline? Nathan said. Caldwell's claim gives you until the end of February under the filing. That's 6 weeks. Hargrove capped his pen. I need 2 weeks to build the response. That gives you 4 weeks to find whatever additional documentation you can. He stood. I'll need to return to Beaumont to file the initial challenge, but I want to hear from you the moment you have anything from those other families. After Hargrove left, Nathan sat at the desk without speaking for a while. Evelyn tidied the papers back into their folders and let him be quiet. "He's the best lawyer in this part of the state," Nathan finally said. "He seemed like it. He's not cheap." "No." Another silence. "You thought of the other families," Nathan said. "I didn't think of that. You've been fighting this like it's a problem between you and Caldwell, but it isn't. He's been doing this to anyone in his way. That means there are other people who have pieces of it." Nathan leaned back in the chair. He looked tired. Not the surface tired of a long ride, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and only recently admitting it has weight. "My brother found something," he said, "before he died. He told me he'd found something about Caldwell, about the water rights manipulation, something to do with the South Creek diversion. We argued about it. I told him to leave it alone, that taking on Caldwell directly was dangerous and not our fight." He stopped. "He died 3 months later, riding accident." He said the last 2 words with a specific flatness, the kind you use when you have a suspicion you cannot prove and have been living with for long enough that speaking it aloud feels like standing at the edge of something. The room was very still. "Do you believe it was an accident?" Evelyn said. Nathan looked at the window. "I don't know what I believe. I know I should have listened to him." She didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say to it, and she wasn't willing to offer something useless. "The South Creek diversion," she said after a moment. "Do you know what specifically he found?" "He had a file. I don't know where it went. After he died, I wasn't in a condition to go through his things carefully. His wife took some. The rest I put in the barn office." Nathan pressed his fingers to his eyes for a moment. "I haven't been in there since." "I think we should look, Chat." The barn office was not a room anyone had been in recently. The smell was of old paper and dust, and the particular closed-air quality of spaces that have been avoided, rather than simply unused. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment before he went in, and she understood what was in that moment without needing to ask. His brother's name had been Cal. She'd gathered this from the way Edmund sometimes said it in conversation, and from a photograph on the hall table that Rose had once pointed to without saying anything, just pointed and looked at Evelyn to make sure she saw. Nathan went in. She followed. The file was in the second drawer of the desk, a manila envelope with Cal Blackthorn's handwriting on the outside. It said simply, Creek/Caldwell. Nathan picked it up and held it for a moment, and she watched his hands do the thing hands do when they're holding something that costs something to hold, and then he opened it. Inside were 12 pages of notes, in a cramped, energetic hand, along with 3 documents that appeared to be survey records, and 2 letters. One of the letters was from a man named Deacon Willis, who described himself as a survey assistant who had been hired by Caldwell's land company in 1891 to falsify the boundary markers along the South Creek, moving them 40 feet east in the official documentation while leaving the physical markers in place. Willis wrote that he'd done it because he needed the money and hadn't understood the full scope of what it would be used for. He wrote that he was ashamed of it. He wrote that he was telling this to Cal Blackthorn because he'd heard Cal was asking questions and he thought someone should know. The other letter was from Cal to Willis, arranging a meeting. The meeting had been in September of 1892. Cal had died in December of 1892. Nathan set both letters on the desk and stood looking at them. His breathing had changed slightly, the way breathing changes when the body understands something before the mind has finished processing it. "Willis," Evelyn said, "do you know if he's still in the county?" "I don't know," Nathan said. His voice was flat in a way that was doing a great deal of work. "I don't know who he is." "Greer might, or Edmund." Nathan picked up the letters and the survey records and held them all together with a careful precision that was almost painful to watch. The deliberateness of a man making sure he did not drop something that cannot be picked up again. "If Caldwell knew Cal had this," he said. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. "Not yet. There's no proof of that, and going down that road right now will pull you away from what you can actually do." He looked at her. His eyes were bright in the way that has nothing to do with tears and everything to do with the specific pressure of a grief that has just been given a new and terrible shape. "You're right," he said. He didn't sound like he wanted to be right about that. "I know," She held out her hand for the documents. "Let me take these inside. We'll get them to Hargrove." He gave them to her. She walked back to the house alone, carrying what might have gotten a man killed, which was a fact she did not let herself look at directly just yet because there was too much else to do, and looking at it directly would use resources she needed elsewhere. Edmund was in the hall when she came through the back door. He'd managed to get himself out of the chair and down the hall on the two bad legs. Not far, but far enough to intercept her. "Nathan found it," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Edmund looked at the envelope. Something in his face moved, something old and deeply set. "Cal told me he was looking into it. Before." He said the word and stopped. "I told him the same thing Nathan did, to leave it alone." "Mr. Blackthorn, don't," he said. The same word she'd used with Nathan, for a different reason. "I've been sitting with that for 2 years, let me say it." He straightened as much as his legs would allow. "What do you need?" "Do you know a man named Deacon Willis?" Edmund's eyes sharpened. "Willis. Survey work. He was out of Garfield County, I think. I haven't heard the name in years. He may have moved, or he may not want to be found." She looked at him steadily. "But if he's alive and willing to speak to Hargrove, what he knows would change this case significantly." Edmund thought about it. "Hetty Crane lives in Garfield County," he said. "She's known everyone in 3 counties since before the war. If Willis is findable, Hetty knows how to find him." "Is she someone you trust?" "She's my cousin," Edmund said, "and she has no use for Victor Caldwell. He tried to buy her property in 1888, and she ran him off her porch with a broom." Something moved through his expression that was almost satisfaction. "Write her a letter. I'll sign it." Caldwell came back himself on Monday. This time Nathan was there. Evelyn was in the kitchen when she heard the buggy, and she stayed in the kitchen. She was not going to stand in doorways watching. That was not her role here, and it would only give Caldwell the satisfaction of an audience. But the kitchen window faced the front of the house at an angle that allowed her to hear if the voices carried, and in the cold morning air they did. She couldn't hear everything. She heard the tone of it. Caldwell's voice smooth and even and patient in the way of someone who has rehearsed this. Nathan's voice lower and controlled. She heard the word Friday spoken by Caldwell with a particular weight. She heard Nathan say something she couldn't make out, and Caldwell respond with a pause before continuing. Then she heard a third voice. Lower, quieter, not Nathan's. She looked out the window and realized that the man standing slightly back from the main conversation near the corner of the porch was Pryor. He'd come in the buggy, but she hadn't seen him at first. He wasn't speaking. He was watching the yard, the barn, the approach to the house, watching it the way someone watches a space they're considering, watching for whether anyone was coming or going who shouldn't be. He turned. His eyes went to the kitchen window and found her there exactly where she was standing, and he held that look for 2 seconds before she stepped back, not from fear, but from the particular instinct of someone who has just realized they've been more visible than they intended. The conversation on the porch ended. The buggy left. Nathan came into the kitchen. His face was doing the controlled thing again, but with more effort than usual. "He moved the deadline," Nathan said, 2 weeks earlier. He's now saying the original filing date was miscalculated, and the claim falls due in 4 weeks instead of 6. Evelyn set down the pan she was holding. "Can he do that?" "His attorney says yes. Hargrove will have a different opinion, but it'll take time to challenge the timeline itself, which eats into the time we have." Nathan sat down heavily. "It's deliberate. He knows I went to Beaumont. He knows I retained someone." "How?" "Crane." She'd thought of that. "He has to know we're looking at the accounts." "Then why is Crane still here?" "Because if Caldwell knows we're building a case, having Crane pull out suddenly tells us exactly how much Caldwell knows. Keeping Crane in place tells Caldwell we're moving slower than we are." Nathan looked at her. "Or Caldwell thinks we're moving slower than we are." Nathan stared at the table. "Hargrove needs to know about the new timeline. I'll write to him today." "But Nathan," she paused, making a decision. "There's something you should know about Pryor." She told him what she'd noticed. The watching, the window, the specific quality of that attention. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "He's done that before," he said, "on the Harmon property. Tom Harmon told told Greer, rather, that in the weeks before the final filing, someone had been watching the farm, noting who came and went. "He's looking for Willis," Evelyn said. Nathan's eyes came up. If Willis is alive and Caldwell knows Cal found him, then Caldwell knows Willis is a risk. He'll have been watching for anyone moving toward Garfield County. She looked at Nathan steadily. "Has anyone gone toward Garfield County recently?" Greer was going to... "Oh, don't send Greer." She said it quickly. Pryor knows Greer's face. He knows everyone associated with this ranch. She thought for a moment. Edmund's letter to his cousin. I can take it. Nathan stared at her. "Evelyn, I'm a housekeeper from Calverton with no land and no money and no family connections, remember? Pryor assessed me as a non-factor. That's useful." She held his gaze. "I can go to Garfield County as a private citizen visiting a friend of the family. No connection to any legal case. Nothing for Pryor to flag. If Caldwell learns you've been helping with this, he's going to learn eventually. The question is whether he learns before or after we have what we need." She paused. "Let me go to Garfield County." Nathan looked at her for a long time. She was aware of what was in that look. Not the assessment of her capabilities, which she suspected he'd moved past some time ago, but something more complicated. The specific difficulty of allowing someone you've started to care about to walk towards something that could be dangerous. She didn't say anything to make it easier. It wasn't her job to make it easier. "All right," he said finally. "But you're not going alone." "I wasn't planning to ask Rose to come with me." He almost smiled. Again, that near thing, that approximation. "I was going to say I'll arrange for one of the hands to ride with you. Caldwell doesn't know all of them." He looked at the table. "Webb, he's been here 2 months. Caldwell won't know his face." "That works. You'll leave early, before the ranch is observed." "Wednesday," she said. "That gives me tomorrow to finish the letter with Edmund." Nathan nodded. He sat there for another moment, not moving, the way he sometimes sat when the thing he was thinking was something he wasn't going to say. Then he got up and went to the study and closed the door, and she heard faintly, through the wall, the sound of him opening the cedar box where the documents were kept. She understood that, the need to look at the evidence of what you were fighting, to make it real, to remind yourself that the hours and the work and the cost of it were building towards something that was worth what it was costing. She understood it because she did the same thing, sometimes, at night, when the ranch was quiet and Rose was asleep and Edmund's lamp was out. She would sit at the kitchen table with her notes and go through the sequence one more time, looking at the shape of what they had and the shape of what they still needed, calculating the distance between those two things and whether the time they had was enough to cross it. Most nights she thought it was. Some nights she was less certain. Those nights she finished her coffee and went to bed and got up at 4:30 and started again, because certainty was not something the situation offered, and waiting for it would be the same as doing nothing, and doing nothing was not something Evelyn Carter had ever known how to do. The fire in the stove had burned low by the time she finally set her notes aside that evening. She banked it for the night, checked the back door, turned down the lamp. In the hall, passing Edmund's door, she heard him breathing in the even way of genuine sleep, which had been difficult for him lately. She paused there for a moment. Then she went to her room and lay down in the dark and thought about Deacon Willis, somewhere in Garfield County, carrying a secret that had probably cost him sleep for 3 years, and whether he was still the kind of man who, given the chance, would do the right thing. She had to believe he was. It was the assumption the whole next step depended on, and in 2 days she was going to find out. They left before dawn on Wednesday. Webb was a young man of perhaps 23, quiet in the easy way of someone who hadn't yet accumulated enough history to make him complicated. He rode well and asked no questions about the purpose of the trip, which Evelyn appreciated. Nathan had told him only that he was escorting the housekeeper on an errand for the family, and Webb had nodded and saddled the horses and appeared at the back of the house at 4:15 without being reminded. The road to Garfield County was not a bad road by Texas standards, which meant it was rough but passable, and in the cold pre-dawn air, it was empty enough that Evelyn felt reasonably certain no one had observed their departure. She rode with Edmund's letter in her coat pocket and Cal Blackthorn's file reproduced in her memory, because she'd spent the last 2 evenings reading it until she could reconstruct the sequence from any point in it without the paper in front of her. Webb rode slightly behind and to her left and said very little. Around mid-morning, he mentioned that his mother had been a school teacher in Arkansas, which seemed to be his way of establishing that he came from people who understood things without needing them explained. Evelyn said that was a good thing to come from. He agreed. That was the extent of their personal conversation for the day. Hetty Crane lived on a small property 6 miles outside the town of Garfield, in a house that had the look of a place managed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it alone for long enough that the systems were all hers and entirely functional. The garden was cut back for winter, but the cutting was orderly. The porch was swept. The woman who appeared at the door before Evelyn had finished tying up was somewhere past 70, small and angular, with eyes the same particular shade of direct as Edmund's. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at Webb. She looked at the road behind them. "You're not being followed," Evelyn said. "I know that," Hetty said. "I've been watching the road for the last hour. Come in." Inside was warm and smelled of coffee and pine, and Hetty Crane moved through her own house with the efficiency of someone who had long since eliminated every unnecessary step. She poured coffee without asking and set it on the table and sat down across from Evelyn and held out her hand. "Edmund's letter," she said. Evelyn gave it to her. Hetty read it without expression, which Evelyn suspected was her natural state rather than a suppression of one. When she finished, she folded it and set it on the table. "Deacon Willis," she said. "You know where he is. He's been in Garfield County since 1893, working a small farm east of town, mostly keeps to himself." Hetty looked at her coffee. "He's been keeping to himself since the winter of 1892, when a man he'd spoken to turned up dead and he made a decision about what kind of person he wanted to be for the rest of his life." "What kind of decision?" "The quiet kind. The kind where you stop talking about what you know and you stop going anywhere near the people who want to know it, because you've worked out that whoever killed that man, if it was killing, didn't know Willis had already spoken." Hetty's voice was flat and informational. "Willis has been living on the assumption that staying small and staying quiet was the thing keeping him alive." Evelyn absorbed this. "And if we go to him, then he has to decide whether that assumption still holds." "It may not hold regardless," Evelyn said. "Caldwell is looking for him, or Pryor is. The fact that Willis has been quiet doesn't mean Caldwell has forgotten he exists." Hetty looked at her steadily. "You're asking me to take you to a man who has spent 3 years being careful about exactly this, and tell him the careful time is over. I'm asking you to take me to a man who has information that could stop Victor Caldwell from taking another family's land and possibly answer a question about how a man named Cal Blackthorn died." Evelyn met her eyes. "Willis has been carrying this alone. That's its own kind of damage. Whatever he decides when we get there, at least he'll be deciding with more information than he has now." Hetty was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up. "Finish your coffee," she said. "His place is 4 miles out." God. Deacon Willis was a thin man who had probably been a different shape before 1892. Not sickly. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who worked physical land every day, but reduced, the way people are reduced when they've been carrying a weight for years and the weight has taken its rent from them steadily. He was in his yard when they came up the road, splitting wood with the focused rhythm of someone doing a thing they've done 10,000 times, and he stopped when he saw Hetty's wagon and stood with the axe in his hands watching them come. When the wagon stopped, he looked at Evelyn the way he'd looked at the road, with a wariness that was not hostility but was not far from it. "Hetty," he said. His voice was careful. "Deacon." She climbed down from the wagon without his help, which appeared to be standard between them. "This is Evelyn Carter. She works for Nathan Blackthorn." Something happened in Willis's face at that name. Not surprised, it was more like a man who has been expecting a particular knock on the door for years and has just heard it. He put the axe down against the woodpile. "You'd better come in," he said. The inside of the house was spare and clean. Willis put coffee on without being asked. It seemed to be the universal gesture in Garfield County, and sat across from them at the kitchen table with his hands flat on it, a posture Evelyn had seen before on a different man in a different kitchen, and which meant approximately the same thing. "I've decided to be here, and here is difficult, so I'm holding myself to the table." "Caldwell is moving against Nathan Blackthorn," Evelyn said. She didn't circle it. "He's filed a fraudulent debt claim against the ranch. the same method he used against the Harmon family and the McCreadys. But Nathan has documentation showing the financial records have been manipulated, and he has a lawyer in Beaumont building a challenge. She looked at Willis steadily. And Nathan found his brother's file, the one with your letter in it. Willis's hands pressed flat against the table. He looked at them, not at her. Cal Blackthorn came to me in October of 1892, he said. It came out like something that had been stored under pressure and had been waiting for a valve. He'd been asking around about the South Creek boundary. He'd found a discrepancy between what the county record showed and what the physical markers said on the ground. He knew someone had altered the survey. A pause. I was that someone. I know, Evelyn said. He looked up. I did it because Caldwell paid me more than I made in a year. I told myself it was just paper, that the markers on the ground were real, that nobody'd actually get hurt. He stopped. That was a lie, I told myself, and I knew it was a lie when I was telling it. Mr. Willis, Evelyn said, I'm not here to hold your choices against you. I'm here because what you know could stop Caldwell from doing this to another family. And what if he finds out I talked? Willis's voice was level, but underneath the level there was something that had been living in that question for a long time. Cal Blackthorn found out what I knew, and 3 months later he was dead. He may have been dead regardless, Evelyn said, because what Cal found wasn't only the survey, it was the letter you wrote him, which means he had evidence. And people with evidence are targets whether they're talking or not. Willis looked at her. You've been quiet for 3 years thinking quiet was what was keeping you safe, she said. But if Caldwell ever remembers that Cal came to you, your quiet doesn't protect you. The only thing that actually protects you is making sure that what you know becomes public in a court, with a lawyer and a judge present, so that silencing you afterward becomes pointless. The kitchen was very still. Outside, a crow somewhere made its flat mechanical sound and stopped. Willis looked at Hetty. She's right, Hetty said. No softening, just the word. Willis sat for a long moment. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He was doing the arithmetic of a man calculating a risk that involves more than numbers. The particular accounting of a person trying to measure how much they can live with against how much they can survive. I have the original survey documents, he said finally. Both sets, the real ones and the ones Caldwell had me alter. I kept them. He said it with a flatness that carried everything. The shame of the original act, the complicated thing it meant that he'd kept the evidence, the years of wondering whether keeping it was courage or just another form of delay. I don't know what I was keeping them for. I just couldn't burn them. Then you already knew this day was going to come, Evelyn said. Not unkindly. You just didn't know which side you'd be on when it did. Willis was quiet for another moment. Then he stood up and went to the back room and came back with a flat tin box. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry and intact across 3 years and 4 seasons, were the documents. Evelyn looked at them without touching them. Both surveys, side by side, the same section of land rendered in 2 different versions of the truth, the alterations clear once you knew to look, the forger's hand evident in the slight difference in ink and line weight at exactly the points where the boundary had been moved. Will you come to Beaumont, she said, to speak with Nathan's lawyer? Willis looked at the box. When? As soon as possible. We have 4 weeks before the filing deadline. He closed the box, held it for a moment. Then he put it in her hands. I'll come, he said. Give me 3 days to sort the farm. They were back at Blackthorn Ranch before nightfall, later than Evelyn had planned because one of the horses had thrown a shoe 8 miles out, and Webb had walked it carefully rather than risk the leg, which was the right decision and added nearly 2 hours to the return. By the time they came up the drive, the main house was lit and Nathan was on the porch. He came down the steps when he saw them. His eyes went to her face first, which told her he'd been worried, which she filed away without examining too closely. You found him, Nathan said. He has both surveys. He'll come to Beaumont in 3 days. She climbed down from the horse. Her back and legs were reminding her forcefully of the distance traveled. He wrote the alterations himself. He knows exactly where every change was made and why. Hargrove will know what to do with him. Nathan stood looking at her in the lamplight spilling from the house. He looked like a man who had spent the day preparing for a worse outcome. "Come inside," he said. "Edmund's been asking about you every hour." "Tell him I said he worries too much." "I'm not telling him that. He'll argue with me for 40 minutes. She almost laughed. It surprised her slightly, the laugh, but not the feeling of it, but the ease of it, how close to the surface it was despite the long, cold day. She went up the steps and inside, and the warmth of the house came around her in the immediate physical way of warmth after real cold. And Rose appeared from the direction of the kitchen holding a piece of bread she'd clearly been eating and stopped when she saw Evelyn. "You're back," Rose said, with the particular mix of relief and attempted casualness that children use when they've been frightened and don't want to say so. "I'm back. I saved you supper." That was thoughtful. "I ate some of it," Rose admitted, "but most of it's there." The following 10 days moved in the compressed, strange way that days move when the thing you've been building toward is suddenly close enough to see clearly. Hargrove came up from Beaumont with 2 associates and took over the study for 3 days, working through everything Evelyn had compiled and everything Willis brought when he arrived on the 4th day, pale and resolute and carrying the tin box under his arm like a man carrying something he'd been putting down and picking up for years and had finally decided to carry all the way to the end. The meeting between Willis and Hargrove lasted most of a day. Evelyn was not in the room for all of it. She was running the household, which did not stop for legal proceedings. But she was in and out enough to watch Willis lose some of the compressed quality he'd walked in with, the way a person loses the brace of long-held tension when they finally say the thing they've been holding. Hargrove was good at this, she noticed, good at letting people arrive at the telling rather than pulling them toward it. By the end of the 2nd day, they had a case. Not a guaranteed case. Hargrove was careful to say this several times, in the measured way of a man who understood that false confidence was a different kind of damage, but a real one. The fraudulent survey documents, the pattern of financial manipulation across 3 separate ranching families, the secondary ledger entries that Dan Crane had continued making throughout the 2 weeks since they decided to let him operate, building a timeline of fraud that was now documented up to the current week. Tom Harmon had come forward with his own records through Greer, and the McCready family's oldest son had sent a letter with documentation from his family's case. Caldwell's scheme, which had relied on individual isolation, each family fighting what appeared to be a single personal dispute, not knowing the others existed, was now visible as the pattern it had always been. On the 11th day, Nathan rode to Calverton and served notice on Dan Crane. He did it himself, without warning, which was not what Evelyn had advised. She'd suggested letting Hargrove manage the timing, but which she understood. There are things that need to be done by the person who is wronged, and done face-to-face, and no amount of legal strategy changes that requirement. She'd known he was going to do it himself from the moment Hargrove confirmed they had enough not to need Crane's continued presence. Crane denied it initially. This was expected. When Nathan put the specific entries in front of him, the dates, the amounts, the external records that contradicted them, Crane went quiet in the way of someone who has been running a calculation and has just arrived at a result they don't like. "Caldwell will deny any connection to me," Crane said. "I know he will," Nathan said. "That's his problem now." He let Crane go. Not to Calverton. Hargrove had arranged with the county sheriff, a man named Briggs, who had no love for Caldwell and sufficient evidence of his own to be cooperative, to have Crane's departure from the county observed. It was a careful line to walk between letting Crane carry information back to Caldwell and making sure that when Caldwell received that information, he received it too late to do anything useful with it. The hearing was set for the 14th of February, which gave them just under 2 weeks. Caldwell came to the ranch one more time before the hearing. He came alone, without Pryor, which was itself a signal of something, either confidence or a calculated performance of confidence, and with Caldwell the difference between those two things was difficult to determine. He came in the evening, which was unusual, and Nathan received him in the main room rather than the study, which Nathan had decided because it was a room where the furniture was his grandfather's, and the weight of the place was most fully itself. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She could hear the voices, but not the words this time. The main room was too far and the door was closed. She occupied herself with the following morning's bread preparation, which required attention and gave her something to do with her hands. and she thought about what Caldwell was doing in that room and what he was not yet doing, which was what mattered. Rose came to the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "There's a man in with Papa," Rose said. "I know." "Is it the bad one?" Evelyn looked at her. "Who told you there was a bad one?" "Grandpa Edmund said there was a situation," Rose said with careful 8-year-old precision, "and that the situation involved a man who wanted what wasn't his. I'm not stupid." "I know you're not." Evelyn moved aside to make room at the counter. "Come roll this dough." Rose came and pressed her small hands into the dough with the particular commitment of a child who has been given something real to do. She was quiet for a while, working. "Is it going to be all right?" she said. The same question she'd asked in the study weeks ago. "I think so," Evelyn said. "More than I did when you asked before." "What changed?" "We found what we needed to find." She paused. "And some people decided to do the right thing even though it was hard. That's what changed." Rose pressed the dough. "Is that always how it works? People deciding?" "When it works, yes." Evelyn looked at the dough. "Sometimes they don't decide, but in this case they did." Rose seemed to think about this with genuine seriousness, the way children think about things that land in them with weight. "I want to be one of the people who decides," she said. "You will be," Evelyn said. "I think you already are." The voices in the main room stopped. A door opened. Footsteps crossed the hall. Evelyn waited. Nathan came into the kitchen. He looked at Rose and then at Evelyn. His expression told her enough. "Caldwell's withdrawing the original claim," he said. Rose's hands stilled in the dough. "He's not admitting to anything," Nathan continued. "He's presenting it as a clerical error in the original filing, a decision to reassess before the hearing. His attorney will file the withdrawal tomorrow morning." He said this with the flatness of a man who has just won a round in a fight that is not finished. He knows what we have. He's cutting the Blackthorn piece loose before it takes everything else with it. "He'll have to cut more than that," Evelyn said. "Hargrove's already submitted the pattern documentation to the county court. The withdrawal of the Blackthorn claim doesn't close the Harmon case or the McCready case." "I know." "And Willis's testimony doesn't go away because Caldwell changed tactics." "I know that too." Nathan sat down. Rose had turned from the counter and was looking at him with wide eyes, dough on both hands. He looked at her and something in his face shifted from whatever it had been doing to something else entirely. The plain, specific love of a father looking at his daughter, uncomplicated by everything else for just that one moment. "Come here," he said. Rose went to him with doughy hands and all, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they were quiet for a moment in the kitchen that Evelyn had been keeping warm for weeks. Then Rose said, with her face against his shoulder, "So the bad man lost?" Nathan looked up at Evelyn over Rose's head. There was something in that look. Gratitude, yes, but more than gratitude. Recognition. The particular look of someone who has seen another person clearly and is not pretending otherwise. "Not yet," he said, "but he's going to." The hearing on the 14th was not, in the end, primarily about Blackthorn Ranch. By the time Hargrove filed his full submission to the Holt County Court, with copies forwarded to the county courts in every jurisdiction where Caldwell's land company operated, the case had grown into something that one ranch's dispute could not contain. 3 families' worth of documented fraud, a falsified survey with the original and the forgery presented side by side, with the man who'd made the alterations present and willing to testify. Financial records showing a pattern of manufactured debt across multiple operations over the better part of a decade. Caldwell arrived with 4 lawyers, which told you something about how he'd assessed the situation. He was not in the courtroom himself when the submissions were read, his attorneys were, and his absence told you something else. Victor Caldwell had spent 20 years building a position in Holt County on the assumption that what he did was invisible, or at least unprovable. The invisibility had held because he'd been careful and because the people he'd targeted had been isolated, and because each fight had looked like a personal dispute rather than a pattern. The moment it stopped looking like a personal dispute, the architecture of his invulnerability stopped holding. Nathan sat at the plaintiff's table with Hargrove. Evelyn was in the gallery between Greer and Edmund, who had insisted on coming despite his legs, and who sat with a cane and a particular expression that she'd come to understand meant he was paying extremely close attention while appearing to pay none. Tom Harmon was there. The McCready son, whose name was James. Deacon Willis, who sat very still in the witness area and looked at nothing in particular with the look of a man who has decided to be somewhere and is making himself be there. When Hargrove presented the dual surveys, there was a particular silence in the courtroom that Evelyn had not expected. Not surprise exactly. The people in the room were mostly people who had suspected something for years without having the form of it. It was more the silence of a shape finally appearing that had been shapeless before. The silence of a thing becoming visible. Caldwell's attorneys objected to nearly everything. This was their job, and they were good at it. The objections were technically grounded and took time to answer, which she suspected was at least partly the point. Delay, complication. The hope that something in the chain of evidence could be found insufficient. It didn't hold. Willis testified for 2 hours. He was not a polished witness. He stumbled twice and had to be redirected by Hargrove, and at one point stopped entirely for almost 30 seconds before resuming, and the 30 seconds were in some ways more convincing than anything he said before or after them, because they were the silence of a man who was telling the truth at real cost and feeling that cost while he told it. Polished witnesses are easy to dismiss. Deacon Willis was not polished and could not be dismissed. Edmund leaned to Evelyn at one point during the testimony and said, very quietly, so only she could hear, "Cal would have been glad to see this." She didn't answer. She put her hand briefly over his on the bench between them, and he let it stay there, and that was all that needed to be said about it. The judge's ruling was not immediate. Nothing in law is immediate, but the preliminary finding issued at the end of the session suspended all pending claims filed by Caldwell's land company in Holt County pending full review. It was not a final victory, but it was the suspension of the threat, and in the specific mathematics of this situation, that mattered more in the short term than anything else. Walking out of the courthouse into the cold February air, Nathan came up beside Evelyn. He didn't say anything immediately. They walked down the courthouse steps with Hargrove ahead of them, talking to the McCready son, and Greer helping Edmund navigate the ice on the lower step with the careful attention of a man who has been watching over things for a long time and has no intention of stopping. "It's not over," Nathan said. "No," she agreed. "Hargrove thinks the full review will take months. Caldwell will contest everything he can." "He will." Nathan looked at the street, at the town that bore his county's name and that he'd been part of all his life, and that had watched this thing happen to his family and to other families and had not been able to stop it. "But it's different now. Everyone knows the shape of it." "Yes." "That was your doing," he said. "That was Willis's doing, and Tom Harmon, and Hargrove." She paused. "And yours. Don't be modest." "I'm not being modest. I'm being accurate." She looked at him. "I found the ledger. I didn't build the ranch or raise the family or spend 30 years earning the kind of trust that made Harmon and Willis willing to come forward when asked. That was already here. I just helped you see what you had." Nathan was quiet for a moment. They had reached the bottom of the steps, and Greer had gotten Edmund to the wagon, and Rose, who had waited in the wagon the entire hearing with the determined patience of someone who had been told firmly that a courthouse was not a place for children and had accepted this while making clear she found it an unjust policy. Rose leaned out of the wagon and looked at both of them. "Is it done?" she said. "Not completely," Nathan said, "but we won today." Rose thought about this. "Then that's enough for today," she said, with the pragmatic logic of someone who has learned not to spend today's energy on tomorrow's uncertainty. Nathan looked at her, then he looked at Evelyn, and the look was not complicated. Or it was, but not in a way that required anything done with it immediately. It was the look of a man who understood fully what was standing in front of him, and understood also that he was not yet in a position to say all of it, and was saying the part he could with his eyes, the way people say things that don't yet have words. Evelyn looked back. Then she climbed into the wagon and pulled her coat tighter against the February cold, and they drove back toward Blackthorn Ranch through the winter afternoon, all of them together, carrying the day's imperfect and necessary victory home. The months that followed the February hearing were not easy months, and anyone who expected them to be had not been paying attention to how these things work. Caldwell contested the preliminary findings through his attorneys, with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had built his position over decades and was not going to surrender it because of one bad afternoon in a county courthouse. He filed objections to the admissibility of Willis's testimony on the grounds that Willis had a personal interest in minimizing his own culpability. He challenged the chain of custody on the dual survey documents. He submitted an alternative accounting of the Harmon and McCready cases that reframed the financial manipulation as clerical error on the part of the families themselves, an argument so audacious that it briefly silenced Hargrove before he recovered and began dismantling it. The full review ran from February through June. 4 months of filings and counterfilings, of Hargrove riding between Beaumont and Holt County with new submissions, of Nathan spending evenings at the study desk reading legal documents that were not written to be read by anyone who hadn't spent years learning the specific language of them. Evelyn read them with him. Not because he asked her to, but because two sets of eyes catch different things, and because by March the pretense that she was only the housekeeper who had stumbled into this accidentally had been quietly set aside by everyone in the household, including Greer, who had never believed it in the first place. The ranch ran through all of it. That was the thing people didn't see from the outside. The legal battle existed on top of the working life of the place, not instead of it. Cattle needed tending regardless of what was filed in the county court. The spring calving season arrived in March with its usual combination of productivity and crisis, 2 calves lost and 7 healthy, and Nathan was in the barn at 2 a.m. for 3 nights running during the difficult stretch of it, which had nothing to do with Caldwell and everything to do with the fact that this was a working ranch, and it worked whether the owner was fighting a legal battle or not. Evelyn made sure food appeared at the right times. She kept the household organized. She helped Rose with her reading in the evenings and sat with Edmund when his legs were particularly bad and the nights were long. She wrote 2 more summary documents for Hargrove at his request, one organizing the timeline of Crane's ledger entries from the period before and after her arrival, one cross-referencing the financial manipulation pattern across all 3 affected families in a format the court had specifically requested. She was not a lawyer. She did not pretend to be one. But she had a particular skill with the architecture of information, the ability to take a large and tangled body of facts and find the structure inside them, the sequence that made the pattern legible. And Hargrove used that skill without apology and credited it plainly when he submitted her work. In April, Dan Crane gave a deposition. This was not something any of them had anticipated. Crane had left the county in January, as Caldwell had directed, and the general assumption had been that he was beyond the reach of the proceedings. But Briggs, the county sheriff, had been more thorough than expected. He'd made contact with the sheriff's office in the county Crane had moved to, and the combination of the fraud documentation and the cross-county cooperation had produced a situation where Crane's options were significantly narrower than he'd believed when he left. He gave the deposition in exchange for reduced personal liability. He was not, it emerged, a man who had designed the scheme. He was a man who had been hired specifically because he was useful for one function and not ambitious enough to be dangerous. In the deposition, he confirmed the mechanics of what he'd been doing in the Blackthorn accounts, confirmed that his instructions had come through an intermediary connected to Caldwell's land company, and confirmed the dates. He could not directly testify to Caldwell's personal knowledge or direction. The intermediary layer existed precisely to prevent that, but he filled in enough of the structure that the gaps left were smaller and more specific, which is often more useful than a large vague absence. When Hargrove sent a summary of the deposition to Nathan, Nathan read it at the kitchen table and then sat for a while without speaking. "He didn't know about Cal," Nathan said finally. "Crane." "He said he didn't," Evelyn said. "You believe him?" She thought about it honestly. "I believe he didn't know the details of it, whether that means it didn't happen the way you think it did." She stopped. "I don't know. Hargrove says the evidence about your brother is circumstantial, that the connection between Cal's investigation and his death can be argued but not proven." Nathan looked at the table. "I know. That's not the same as it not being true. I know that too." He pressed his hands flat on the table, that posture again, that holding himself to the surface of things when the depth was too much. "I've been sitting with not knowing for 2.5 years. I can keep sitting with it." He looked up. "What I can't keep sitting with is letting Caldwell keep operating like nothing happened." He won't, Evelyn said. Hargrove's confident about the fraud finding. That's the thing that can be proven, and it's enough. She was right about that. In June, the full review produced its findings. The Holt County Court, in a ruling that ran to 40 pages and that Hargrove read cover to cover on the ride back and described over supper as thorough in a way that suggested he hadn't entirely expected it, found that Victor Caldwell's land company had engaged in a pattern of fraudulent financial representation across 3 documented cases, with evidence suggesting additional cases that the court did not have full jurisdiction to address. The Blackthorn debt claim was dismissed with prejudice, which meant it could not be refiled. The Harmon and McCready families received orders for the return of land and financial remedy for documented losses. The falsified survey records were entered into the county's permanent record, which meant that any future transaction involving those land boundaries would be conducted against a documented history of prior manipulation. Caldwell's attorney filed an appeal within 10 days. This was expected. Hargrove had already prepared the response, which was a document Evelyn privately thought was some of the cleanest legal writing she'd ever read, and said so. "Don't tell him I said that," Hargrove told her, gathering his papers at the kitchen table after his 3rd visit to the ranch that month. "He'll become insufferable." "He's already fairly confident," she said. "Yes, but currently he's confidently right, which is manageable. Once you start telling him he's exceptional, he starts second-guessing himself out of the need to justify it." Hargrove put his hat on. "The appeal will take another few months, but the core finding stands. Caldwell can't use the county court system here again without that record following him in. That's the real outcome." He left. Nathan walked him to his horse, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and watched them stand there for a moment. The lawyer who had come because Nathan had asked, and because the case was worth coming for, and the rancher who had nearly lost everything to a patient and specific kind of evil, talking in the early summer evening with the ease of 2 men who had been through something together and come out the other side not unscathed but intact. She thought about her father, who had been through something similar and had not come out intact, who had not had a Hargrove or a Willis, or anyone who knew how to read the architecture of the scheme and find its seams, who had simply lost, slowly and then completely, in the way that people lose when the system they're fighting in is designed by the person fighting them. She thought about this without bitterness. The bitterness had been there once. She was honest enough with herself to know that, but it had long since been replaced by something that was not quite its opposite but was more useful. A clarity about how these things worked, an understanding of where the pressure could be applied, where the structure was weak, what it took to make the visible visible. That was what she'd brought to Blackthorn Ranch. Not rescue, not heroism, just the specific knowledge that comes from having watched something fail and having spent years afterward understanding why. The summer was different from the winter she'd arrived in. That sounds obvious, and it was, but the difference wasn't only the season. The house itself was different, not in the way that things are different after dramatic events, all changed and significant and weighted, but in the quieter way that houses change when people in them start talking to each other again. Nathan ate breakfast with Rose most mornings now, which had not been the case when Evelyn arrived. It wasn't a large or performative thing. He came in, he sat down, he asked her about school or about the particular horse she'd been fixated on since April. He listened to the answer. But it happened consistently, which is what makes a thing real rather than occasional. Edmund was not better. His legs were not going to be better, and the summer heat added its own difficulty. But he was more present. He'd started asking Greer for daily reports on the ranch's operations, which Greer delivered with the same compressed precision he applied to everything, and which Edmund received with the alert attention of a man who had run this land himself and had opinions about how it should be run and was no longer pretending he didn't. Nathan and Edmund argued occasionally about cattle management decisions in the direct, unceremonious way that fathers and sons argue about things they both actually care about, which was a significant improvement over the silence that had existed between them when Evelyn arrived. Rose turned 8 in May and announced at breakfast that she wanted a party, not a small one, which had not happened since her mother was alive, and Nathan had looked briefly at Evelyn over Rose's head with an expression that contained, in roughly equal parts, the desire to say yes and the uncertainty about how, and Evelyn had said, I can manage the food if you arrange the guests. And that had been the end of the deliberation. 7 children came. There was cake. 2 of the ranch hands built a game with wooden rings and a post in the yard that descended into mild chaos. Rose declared it the best day she could remember, which she was probably overstating, but not by as much as you might think. Tom Harmon came by the ranch in July, not on any legal business, but because he was working the Prescott place nearby and had heard Nathan was looking for an extra hand for the late summer cattle work. Nathan hired him on the spot without any ceremony about it. Harmon was a good worker and a capable one, and within 2 weeks he was part of the working rhythm of the place, in the way that capable people settle into places that need what they have. His wife came once to bring him his forgotten lunch, and ended up staying to help Evelyn with the summer preserving, and by the end of the afternoon they'd worked through 3 bushels of peaches together and a quantity of conversation that covered everything from practical matters to things that were harder to name. Her name was Clara, and she'd been carrying the weight of the Harmon family's loss with the particular stoic efficiency of women who don't have the option of not carrying it. And she sat in Evelyn's kitchen in August and talked for the first time, to someone who understood the specifics of it, about what it had been like to watch the scheme take their land before anyone understood what was happening. "I knew something was wrong," Clara said. "I knew it in the way you know things before you can say what you know. But Tom kept saying it was a legal matter and it would resolve, and I believed him because I needed to believe him." She was quiet for a moment. "By the time it was clear it wasn't going to resolve, we didn't have enough left to fight it." "That's how it was designed to work," Evelyn said. "The delay is part of it. The thing goes on long enough that you've used your resources fighting it before you understand what you're fighting." Clara looked at her. "How did you know what it was?" "I'd seen it before," Evelyn said, "a smaller version of it, and I came in late enough that I wasn't inside the delay. I was looking at it from outside, which makes it easier to see." She set down the jar she'd been packing. "It wasn't exceptional insight. It was timing and a different angle of view." Clara looked unconvinced by this modesty, but she let it go. What Evelyn didn't say, because it would have required explaining things she didn't yet have the right words for, was that she'd also been looking for it. Not the specific scheme. She hadn't known what she was walking into, but she'd arrived at Blackthorn Ranch already alert to the kinds of pressure that could be applied to a family from outside, already accustomed to reading the space between what people said and what was actually happening, already constitutionally inclined to find the thing that was wrong in a set of numbers rather than trusting the numbers to be right. These were not virtues exactly. They were adaptations. They were what happened when you came from the kind of background that teaches you early that things are often not what they appear, and that the only protection against that is attention. She didn't think of herself as exceptional for having learned this. She thought of it as the particular education her life had provided, and she'd used it because it was there to be used. The appeal failed in September. Hargrove sent a letter that Nathan read at the breakfast table with Rose on his left and Evelyn across from him and Edmund at the head where he'd started eating again when his legs allowed, which was most mornings now. Nathan read it twice. Then he put it down. "It's done," he said. Nobody said anything for a moment. "Does that mean the bad man lost?" Rose asked, without looking up from her eggs. She'd been asking this question periodically since February, with the persistent calm of someone tracking a long project. "That means the bad man lost," Nathan said. Rose nodded. "Good," she said, and went back to her eggs. Edmund made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. The sound of an old man who has seen a great deal and finds, at this particular moment, that a child's simple assessment is more satisfying than anything an adult could have said. He picked up his coffee, drank it, looked out the window at the land his family had held for 3 generations, which was still there, which would still be there, which would go to Rose someday, and to whatever she made of it. Later that morning, Nathan came to find Evelyn in the garden, where she was doing the September work of cutting back and putting to bed and thinking about what to plant in the spring. He stood at the edge of the garden and watched her work for a moment, which she was aware of but didn't react to, because some conversations need to find their own beginning and rushing them doesn't help. "Hargrove says Caldwell's land company is under investigation in 2 other counties now," Nathan said, The pattern we documented opened other people's ability to file. That's what patterns are for. 4 other families may get remedy. He paused. He can't operate in Holt County anymore. Any transaction he tries to file will be reviewed against the documented history. Good. It's not nothing, Nathan said. Evelyn, what we did, what you helped build, it's not nothing. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The September light was the particular warm and angled light of that month, the kind that makes everything look slightly more deliberate than usual. I know it's not nothing, she said. I never thought it was nothing. He looked at her. Something in him was trying to find its way to a shape. She could see that. The same quality she'd noticed back in January when he'd stood in the barn office with his brother's documents in his hands. The working through of something that was larger than the words immediately available for it. When you came here, he said, you came for a job. I did. You didn't come to fix anything. No. And yet, he stopped, started again in a different place. I've been trying to understand what it is exactly, why you stayed when it got complicated, why you put yourself in the position you did, why someone with no stake in this ranch took on the risk you took on. She thought about this honestly, because he deserved an honest answer and not a graceful one. I've been asking myself that too, she said. Some of it was practical. The situation was there, and I had the skills for it, and it would have felt wrong to have those skills and not use them. She pulled a dried stem from the ground. But that's not all of it. What's the rest? She looked at the garden. This place needed someone to stay, she said. Not rescue, not saving, just staying, being present consistently and doing the work in front of you without leaving when it becomes inconvenient. I grew up watching people leave when things got hard. I watched my father's situation lose every person who could have helped it because helping it was uncomfortable and leaving was easier. She set the stem aside. I don't leave when things get hard. That's not a virtue. It's just who I am. And it turned out that staying was what this particular situation needed. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. He sat down on the low garden wall, which put him closer to her level, which she didn't think was accidental. I haven't been easy to work for, he said. No. I've been closed for a long time. I know that. You had reasons. I told you before that reasons aren't excuses. I told you they were still reasons. She looked at him. You're not the same as you were in January. You must know that. He looked at his hands. Rose told me last week that I laugh more than I used to, he said. She said it very matter-of-factly, like she was reporting on the weather. I didn't know whether to be glad or ashamed that she'd noticed. Be glad, Evelyn said. She noticed because she was watching for it. She's been watching for it for a long time. Nathan looked at the garden, at the careful work of it, the ordered beds, and the attention they represented. Then he looked at her. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not as the housekeeper. I know that's what you came as, and I'm not... He stopped. The precision that usually served him abandoned him momentarily, the way precision sometimes does when you're saying the thing you most need to say. I'm not assuming anything. I know it's not a simple thing to ask, but I want you to know that when I say stay, I mean here. As more than what you came as. I mean it as an honest statement, not a pressure. She looked at him for a long moment. She had known this was coming in the way that you know weather is coming. Not the specific day, but the direction of it, the shift in the air. She'd been turning it over for weeks, not avoiding it, but not moving toward it either, letting it find its own time. Nathan, she said, I want to ask you something directly. All right. Are you asking me because you need someone here? Because the ranch needs a person in this role and I've fit it well? He met her eyes. No. Are you asking because you're grateful for what happened with Caldwell? No? He said it without hesitation, which was the answer she needed. Then why? He thought about it. He did not rush his answer, which was one of the things she had come to trust about him. The willingness to be slow rather than say something that wasn't accurate. Because you're the first person I've met since Margaret died, who I can be in a room with and not feel like I'm performing, he said. The first person who tells me the truth even when I haven't asked for it. The first person Rose has looked at like—" He stopped. "She looks at you the way she used to look at her mother. Not the same because you're not the same person, but the same quality of looking. Like you're someone she doesn't have to explain herself to." The garden was quiet. Somewhere behind the barn a horse shifted and was still. "I'm not easy either," Evelyn said. "I'm direct in ways that irritate people. I have opinions about things I haven't been asked my opinion on. I'll read your ledgers without permission if I think something's wrong in them. I know all of that. I'm not a simple person to have in your life. I'm aware." Something crossed his face that was fully a smile now, complete and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen on him before. "I'm not asking for simple." She looked at him. She looked at the ranch around them, the barn and the house and the fence lines running out toward the horizon, the land that 3 generations of his family had held and that the 4th generation would hold now because people had been willing to do what needed doing. She thought about the small room off the kitchen where she'd spent the winter, and the study where she'd sat with ledgers until midnight, and the kitchen where Rose had pressed dough with both hands and asked if the bad man was going to lose. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere, not to arrive and perform belonging, but to have it happen the way things happen when you do the work of one day and then the next, and don't leave in between. She had not expected to find it here, at a ranch in Holt County in the winter of her 27th year, but she had learned enough about the way life distributes its gifts to know that expectation is not a reliable guide to what you actually need. "All right," she said. Nathan looked at her. All right meaning yes," she said. "I'll stay." They were married in October, on a clear morning that had the particular quality of Texas autumn at its best. Not the brutal heat of summer or the bitter cold of what was coming, but a middle space that felt, for a few weeks, like the landscape was resting and content to let you rest with it. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted a large wedding. Greer stood with Nathan. Hetty Crane came from Garfield County, which Evelyn had not expected and which moved her more than she showed. Tom Harmon and Clara were there. Hargrove sent a letter that made Edmund laugh when he read it aloud, which was a gift in itself. Edmund walked her in on his 2 bad legs, with his cane, moving slowly and without complaint, which was exactly how Edmund did everything he decided to do. He had asked her 2 days before if she would allow it, in the particular formal register he used when something mattered very much to him, and he didn't want to be refused because he'd phrased it too casually. "I'd be honored," she told him. "It should be your father," he said. "I know that." "My father would have liked you," she said. "He would have liked you very much." Edmund had looked at his hands for a moment. Then he'd nodded and not said anything else about it. Rose wore a dress she'd chosen herself, which was blue and entirely impractical for a ranch wedding and suited her completely, and she stood beside Evelyn with the solemn commitment of a child who understands that she's participating in something real. Afterward, when it was done, and the small gathering had moved to the long table Greer and the hands had set up in the yard, Rose came to stand beside Evelyn with the particular sidelong approach that children use when they're not sure how to say something directly. "Does this mean you're my mother now?" Rose asked. Evelyn looked at her. The directness of it, the plainness of it, the way Rose had simply asked the thing she needed to know, instead of circling it. "That's for you to decide," Evelyn said. "What it means to you is what it means. I'm not going to tell you what to call it." Rose thought about this. "I had a mother," she said. "I know. She was different from you. I know that too. But you stayed," Rose said. "When things were hard, you stayed." She looked up at Evelyn with the direct eyes she'd inherited from her father and her grandfather and every Blackthorn who'd stood on this land and held it. "That counts for something." "It counts for a great deal," Evelyn said. Rose nodded, satisfied, and went to find the food. Here is what the story of Evelyn Carter and Nathan Blackthorn is actually about. Underneath the ledgers and the legal proceedings and the careful accumulation of evidence that brought down a patient and specific kind of evil. It is about what happens to people who have stopped believing that staying is possible. Nathan had stopped believing it, not consciously. He hadn't made a decision about it, but grief had taught him that the things you hold get taken, and the logical adaptation to that lesson is to hold less, to close off the rooms, to run the ranch and raise the daughter and keep the empire functioning while keeping yourself at a certain distance from the reality of it, because distance feels like protection. It isn't. It's just a different kind of loss, the slow kind. The kind that happens so quietly, you don't notice until you're in a room full of expensive furniture and empty air and a child growing up in the silence between them. Evelyn brought no particular magic to this. She was a woman who paid attention and told the truth, and didn't leave when things were inconvenient. These are not dramatic qualities. They don't make a good first impression in the way that charm does or beauty does, or the easy warmth that makes people feel immediately comfortable. What they do is accumulate. They compound. Over days and weeks, they build a texture of reliability that becomes, without announcement, the most important thing in a person's world. She had learned this not from success, but from its absence. She had learned it watching her father lose what he'd built, because he hadn't had the tools to protect it. She had learned it working for other people's households, being present in spaces where her presence was secondary, developing the particular skill of someone who has been secondary long enough to understand exactly what that space requires and how to inhabit it without disappearing into it. She had never been invisible. That was the thing Caldwell had miscalculated, the thing Pryor had assessed wrong, the thing the town of Calverton had misunderstood when they saw a poor girl taking a housekeeper position at a wealthy ranch. They had looked at what she had. No land, no money, no family connections, no status, and concluded that this was what she was, a sum of her deficits. What she actually was could not be read from what she owned. It could only be read from what she did, and she had not yet done it in a place that required it, so there was nothing to read. Blackthorn Ranch required it, and she did it. And the doing of it, sustained over months without requiring acknowledgement or reward, is what makes a person real in the life of a place. Not the dramatic gesture, but the sustained showing up. Not the rescue, but the daily work of being present and honest and willing to see things clearly, even when clarity is uncomfortable. This is not a lesson about women being stronger than anyone thought. It is not a lesson about humble origins producing exceptional people. Those are versions of the story that make it feel extraordinary, and it isn't extraordinary. It is the most ordinary thing in the world, a person in the right place at the right time, with the right formation of attention and willingness, doing the work that was in front of her. The world is full of people with that formation. Most of them never find the situation that requires it visibly enough for anyone to see it happen. Evelyn did. That was circumstance as much as anything she controlled. What she controlled was what she did with the circumstance. Blackthorn Ranch in the years that followed was not transformed into something unrecognizable. The land was the same land. The cattle were the same cattle, more or less, plus new calves and minus old animals, and the ongoing arithmetic of a working operation. Greer was still Greer, compressed and competent and quietly devoted to the place in the way of people who have given their working life to something and find that the giving has made it theirs in a way ownership alone cannot. Edmund's legs did not improve. He died in the spring of the following year quietly and without drama, in the chair by the window that Evelyn had moved to face the light. He had been aware for months that this was coming, and he had been, in his particular way, at peace with it, not because he'd resolved everything or made everything right, but because the last year of his life had contained things he hadn't believed possible after his son died. He'd seen Nathan come back from wherever grief had put him. He'd seen Rose become less lonely. He'd seen the land his family had built survive a threat that had taken other families' land, and he'd seen it survive because people had been willing to be useful to each other. He told Evelyn, 3 weeks before he died, that she had given his son back to him. "I didn't give him anything," she said. "He was always there." "I know," Edmund said. "But knowing something is there and being able to reach it are different things." He looked at the window. "You were the bridge. I know you don't want to be called that. You'll say it's not accurate and it wasn't what you set out to do. But some things are true whether you set out to do them or not." She didn't argue with him. He was right, and he was old, and some arguments aren't worth having. She sat with him until he slept, and she thought about what it meant to be a bridge. Not heroic, not the thing that people look at, just the thing you cross to get from one place to the other, the thing that holds the weight and makes the crossing possible. She had been called many things in her life, and she would not have chosen bridge as the word, but she understood what he meant. Tom Harmon got his land back in November of that year, following the completion of the multi-county fraud review. The McCready family received financial remedy the following spring. Deacon Willis, who had carried his guilt across 3 years of deliberate invisibility, began to look, by the following summer, like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying too long. He still worked his farm in Garfield County. He still kept to himself mostly, but there was a certain quality that had been in him when Evelyn first met him, that compressed, held-in-place quality of someone waiting for the consequences of a thing that was no longer there. She saw him once more, a year after the appeal failed, at a county gathering that had nothing to do with any of it. He was talking to Tom Harmon at the edge of the yard, not animated, but not closed either. The two men standing in the easy way of people who share a history that didn't break them and don't need to talk about it to acknowledge it. He saw her and nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. Caldwell left Holt County. This happened over the course of the winter, gradually and without announcement. His office in Calverton closed. His man Pryor was not seen after November. The land company's operations in the county quietly ceased. Where he went was not something Evelyn tracked closely, because tracking him was not her job, and had never been. The investigation in the other counties continued without her involvement. Whatever the outcome was, it happened somewhere else, in courtrooms she didn't sit in, involving families she hadn't met. She thought sometimes about those families, the ones she didn't know, the ones who'd been through the same scheme and hadn't had a Hargrove or a Willis or a woman who arrived in the winter with an accidental eye for false ledgers, the ones who'd lost and not gotten it back. She thought about them without the particular guilt of someone who survived when others didn't. She hadn't survived through luck. She'd worked for it, and she knew the work didn't guarantee the outcome. It only improved the odds. But she thought about them. This is the thing about doing something right. It doesn't fill in the space of all the times it went wrong. It doesn't retroactively fix what couldn't be fixed. It sits beside the losses without canceling them, and you carry both, what you managed to protect and what you couldn't, and you don't pretend one means the other didn't happen. Evelyn had carried her father's loss for 7 years. She carried it still. It didn't weigh less because she'd helped save Blackthorn Ranch, but it had changed shape, the way grief changes when it's set beside something that worked out differently. She understood now that her father's failure hadn't been inevitable. It had been a particular combination of circumstances and timing, and the absence of someone with the right formation of attention at the right moment. That was not a comforting thought exactly, but it was a true one, and she preferred true thoughts to comforting ones. On a morning in November, more than a year after she'd arrived at Blackthorn Ranch with nothing but a bag and a pair of boots held together by stubbornness, she stood at the kitchen window before dawn with her coffee and looked out at the land that was now also hers, in the way that things become yours when you fought for them and stayed for them and built your daily life inside them. Nathan came in from the barn. He stamped the cold off his boots and came to stand beside her, and she gave him the coffee and he took it without needing to ask what it was, which is the particular intimacy of people who know each other's movements well enough that the language of small things is fluent between them. They stood at the window together and looked at the land going gray and then lighter in the pre-dawn. "Edmund used to stand here," Nathan said. "In the mornings." "I know, he told me. He said he did it to remember what he was running for." Nathan turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I didn't understand that when he told me. I thought it was sentiment." "What do you think now?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think it's not sentiment. I think it's just accountability. Reminding yourself what you owe to the place and the people in it, so you don't start running it for something else, for pride or habit, or because you can't think of anything else to do." She looked at him sideways. "When did you get wise?" "I'm not wise," he said. "I just live with someone who asks the right questions, and I've been paying attention." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that doesn't require any face to see it, just a warmth that happens in the body, in the place below the ribs where the things that are real live. Outside, the land was coming into its morning. The fence lines emerged from the dark first, then the barn, then the far pasture where the cattle were already beginning to move. Somewhere in the house, Rose would be waking up in approximately 20 minutes, and would appear in the kitchen with her hair in its usual state of optimistic disorder, and some strong opinion about what she wanted for breakfast. It was an ordinary morning. It was the kind of morning that people who haven't lost anything don't understand the value of, because they haven't yet learned that ordinary mornings are not the backdrop of life. They are the thing itself. They are what you are protecting when you stand in courtrooms and read ledgers by lamplight and ride 6 miles in the cold to find a man who needs to tell the truth. Evelyn Carter had learned this early, the hard way, in a farmhouse in Denton County where the ordinary mornings had ended one by one, and she hadn't understood until they were gone what they'd been worth. She understood now. She drank her coffee. The sun came up over Blackthorn Ranch, the same as it always had, the same as it would tomorrow, and she let herself stand in it without needing it to be anything other than exactly what it was.